All right, welcome to APUSH Chapter 11, Part 4. We finished off talking about how people were moving to the cities. They were kind of these really dangerous places and everything. And really that people were needing entertainment for distraction, especially the poorer people working a lot of those industrial jobs. You had a lot of blood sports between boxing and cockfighting and whatever it may be. You also had probably the most popular thing was called minstrel shows. Minstrel shows made use of white actors using blackface, basically to stereotype and poke racial fun at African Americans. And their favorite character was a character by the name of Jim Crow. And that's really where you start getting Jim Crow laws. They just in the South, all the laws that were biased against slaves would be known as Jim Crow laws. Really, what these shows did was they emphasized the importance of being white. So at the end of the day, instead of it sucking to be a poor Irishman or a poor German, it's still at this point, at least you're not black, is how they would view it. But that being said, you have all these newcomers coming to the city, and you'll see that nativism is going to rise up, and really they're going to restrict jobs to the Irish to be things like domestic servants. Your Irish weren't going to have good jobs. They were going to take the lowest of the low. It might be similar to today's Mexicans. Irish would have filled those jobs back in the day. Today, Mexicans fill those jobs. The New Yorkers, native New Yorkers and native big city people didn't like newcomers challenging their tradition. The Catholics are going to come in and have a slightly different tradition. The Germans are coming in, establishing kind of German towns and drinking German beer and using German butter or whatever it may be. And so they didn't really care for that too much. Now, probably the biggest social reform movement in this time period, one that we really need to focus on, is called abolitionism. Of course, abolition is the freeing of slaves. Without a doubt, the Second Great Awakening is a big part of what really drives abolitionists to, they have a sense of religious duty to free the slaves from bondage. In the Northeast, blacks basically, even though they were free, they're not really respected. They're really going to be limited on what jobs that they can use. You had free blacks like David Walker, who wrote books about slavery and attacking slavery, basically. He warned of a massive slave revolt. Many of them kind of tried to put that fear factor out there, but really there was only a handful of revolts, and never any that were successful. Remember, his views were deemed too radical for most of the abolitionists, and typically what they tried to do was uplift and really just get race equality. They're not really trying to promote violence or anything like that. Again, you could kind of put it for today's Black Lives Matters. Some people think that they're about violence, but the Black Lives Matters movement head would tell you that's not what they're about. So, we'll see. We can talk about it a little bit more in class. Speaking of revolts, though, there was one important revolt that you need to know, and it happened in Virginia, and it was led by a man named Nat Turner, who basically felt like God was talking to him to lead his people out of slavery. He killed about 55 white people, and it really ended in utter disaster because his people were things were worse on him because hundreds of blacks would end up being killed, and it would bring in harsher black codes on blacks. They would be able to congregate in groups of more than a couple at a time and stuff like that. So it actually made things worse for African Americans. About the same time as Turner's Rebellion, Northern evangelicals basically go on a moral crusade to end slavery. Probably the guy you really need to know more than anybody else is William Lloyd Garrison. He is a white man. He's the editor of his own newspaper called The Liberator. He is no holds barred. Slavery must end unabashedly. He's from Massachusetts. Demands emancipation, the freedom of slaves, and understand that. I guess we'll really wait for the next part to really talk about it. But I want to finish with the three main motives of the abolition movement. So we'll talk about that in part 5.